Here's Ben Shapiro to be a science denialist.
Why do you believe you're right about trans people given the American Psychological Association, American Medical Association, American Psychoanalytic Association, I can go on for about 5 more associations that are very prominent and govern the existing health government or health industries within the major Western countries. And all of these associations have multiple thousands of doctors, sociologists, psychologists, and with PhDs in their respective fields backing the idea that sex and gender are different, effectively gaining the medical consensus for sex and gender being 2 different concepts, yet you have a different opinion.
Okay, so sex and gender are 2 different concepts, but gender is tied to biology.
What do you mean by tied to biology? You are denying the science if what you mean by this is that they always correlate. If you think a person with insemination physiology is always a man and a person with gestation physiology is always a woman, you either deny the mountains of evidence against this, or you are using different definitions of man and woman than the definitions used by every major scientific institution that researches the topic.
So one of the big problems that you see in sort of the argument in favor of trans rights is this notion that gender and sex are completely separable. They're not completely separable. If they are completely separable, then this means that identifying people by their subjective gender really has no relevance as to whether they are a male or a female.
Well, what do you mean by no relevance? I don't recall ever hearing anyone claim that there's no probabilistic relationship between the two at all, if that's what you mean. If someone indicates that they have insemination physiology, that person is probably a man. Again, I've never heard anyone claim anything to the contrary. The point is that such a person is not necessarily a man, and it is perfectly legitimate for such a person to not be a man.
Male and female are biological terms. So using terminology like male and female to describe a self-perception of maleness or femaleness is sort of a bizarre way of arguing whether a thing is a man or a woman.
Using the terms male and female is often confusing for people who have trouble with distinguishing them from man and woman, which is why, for the sake of clarity, I often say people with insemination physiology and people with gestation physiology.
So here's my question. It's an argument that my friend Matt Walsh likes to make. What is a woman? Define what a woman is without reference to the word woman, please.
Because an individual's gender identity is subjective, what it means to be any particular gender identity is going to vary from individual to individual. If you ask a large sample set of women what their womanhood means to them, you will probably hear some broad conceptual overlap between their answers, but you certainly won't hear a unanimous definition, nor do I think you will even be able to infer any universally applicable necessary or sufficient conditions from their answers. The necessary and sufficient conditions for one's own womanhood is up to each individual woman to decide for herself. So what? Why is that a problem? Why do you think this is some kind of gotcha?
So this is actually a logical fallacy called a red herring. You're asking me a question in order to actually challenge my question without actually
No, it isn't. I'm saying that
my...
it really is not. I'm saying that biology, I'm agreeing with you that the notion of gender, which is effeminateness or masculinity.
That's not what the notion of gender is. A person can be effeminate and still be of the male gender. Let's look at how scientists actually use these terms. The American Psychological Association's Guidelines for Psychological Practice with Transgender and Gender Non-Conforming People says that gender identity is defined as a person's deeply felt inherent sense of being a girl, woman, or female, a boy, a man, or male, a blend of male or female, or an alternative gender. So notice that the APA does not include effeminateness or masculinity in their definition of gender identity. And also, they are using the terms male and female as gender terms, not exclusively as biological terms.
Can be different from biology in the sense that biology is just pure male or pure female.
Biology is not just pure male and pure female. Intersex people exist. A person with androgen insensitivity syndrome can be genotypically male, meaning that they have all the genes that usually cause the development of insemination physiology, but phenotypically female, in that they actually end up developing gestation physiology. Some people are born with insemination characteristics, but develop gestation characteristics at puberty, or vice versa. Then even at the genetic level, there are folks with mosaic DNA, meaning they have 2 sets of DNA. Sometimes this can mean some of their chromosomes are XY and some of their chromosomes are XX. I think it would be silly to call such a person purely male or female in a strictly biological sense.
But to suggest that there is such a thing as an effeminate male is not to suggest that an effeminate male is now a woman.
Well, that's up to each individual to decide for oneself. If you have insemination physiology and you are effeminate, whether that effeminacy makes you a woman or not is for you to decide. Some such individuals will decide it makes them women. Some will decide that it simply means they're effeminate men. Some may decide it makes them non-binary. Why is that a problem?
Transgenderism makes the argument that if you believe that you are a woman, you are therefore a woman.
This isn't really an argument so much as it is a definition. Gender identity is, by definition, the belief that one is a girl, woman, or female, a boy, a man, or male, a blend of male or female, or an alternative gender. If you have a problem with that definition, you have an essentially semantic problem. You just don't like that people use those words that way. Well, sorry, Ben. Use determines what words mean. That's just how language works.
Or if you believe that you are a man, you are therefore a man. I disagree with this. There are objective measures as to whether you're a man or a woman.
According to the definitions of those terms used by many of the major scientific organizations that study gender, there are, by definition, no objective measures of manhood and womanhood.
There are objective measures as to whether you're male or female. There's certainly a spectrum when with regard to effeminateness versus masculinity. That's certainly true, but that does not change the underlying sexual dichotomy that is the basis for all human reproduction.
Even that's an oversimplification. You can be genetically male and still reproduce with someone else who is also genetically male. I'll link to a study in the description of a couple of parents who both have XY chromosomes and who, nonetheless, managed to conceive 2 children. Also, Ben still seems to think that man and woman are categories that are decided by what reproductive organs a person has.
Yeah, you can answer.
Right. So this dichotomy is a false dichotomy that isn't supported by any of the medical associations that I just named off.
Then let me
None
explain.
of the medical associations that I just named off would actually support the idea that gender is biological. This is something that's completely untrue within every single medical consensus.
Well, then I will just say that anyone who suggests that gender has no reference whatsoever to biology, it's not connected in any way to biology, is just full of shit.
It's also something nobody is claiming. As I said before, I've never heard anyone deny that there is a correlation, albeit an imperfect one, between reproductive biology and gender identity that you can see from the fact that most people with insemination physiology identify as men and most people with gestation physiology identify as women. The point is that they don't always correlate, and that it's perfectly fine that they don't always correlate.
Because if the and the reason I and the reason that I say
then you actually just disagree with medical consensus
yes,
within the
I
Western
disagree.
nations.
Yes, I disagree with the false medical consensus.
Now this looks like Ben's interlocutor is saying that the medical consensus agrees with Ben's straw man, but I found this person on Twitter where you can find a clarification that says, to be very clear, when I said you disagree with medical consensus, this was responding to the statement Ben made that was gender is biological. I've still never heard anyone claim that gender identity does not correlate with biology at all. The fact that there is some imperfect correlation is irrelevant. Again, the point is that they don't always correlate.
Driven by politically driven, quote-unquote doctors.
Like creationists, folks who have a problem with trans people resort to explaining why many of the most influential scientific institutions disagree with them with conspiracy theories.
If any doctor denies to me that there is a dichotomy between male and female, a sexual dichotomy between male and female, they're ignorant.
To say that everyone on the planet fits into either a male box or a female box requires you to squeeze some people into boxes in which they are a pointlessly awkward fit. A person with XY chromosomes who can get pregnant is a clear example. But why is Ben even bringing this up? This is quite a tangent from the original issue, which is whether trans men are legitimately men and trans women are legitimately women.
And they are letting their politics get in the way of their science. Anybody who suggests to you that there is such a thing, for example, as a pregnant male is not a doctor, they are an activist.
So the documented case of a person who was genetically male who got pregnant was a hoax then? Or does genetic maleness not count? Even if you don't think genetic maleness counts, it still remains a fact that there are people who are genetically male but phenotypically female, making it clearly an oversimplification to lump everybody into either a male category or a female category.
I'm very glad that none of these opinions are actually accepted in academia and haven't been for over 70 years. Sent this here on Twitter.
Okay, so the notion that they haven't been accepted for over 70 years is a bizarre one, considering they were accepted until about 5 minutes ago.
Ben, the APA guidelines I cited above say that as early as the 1950s, research found variability in how an individual described their gender, with some participants reporting a gender identity different from the culturally defined, mutually exclusive categories of man or woman. I don't know whether scientists were already rejecting the idea of gender being dichotomous by then, but they were certainly finding reasons to.
And the basic idea that male and female do not exist runs counter to all mammalian biology, all of it, not just human.
Where is Ben getting the idea that anyone is claiming that male and female don't exist? Who's saying that? The discovery of additional categories doesn't negate all previously established categories.
Are we to suggest that gender and sex are different in walruses? How does this work exactly?
Well, let's say that gender identity is an exclusively human phenomenon. So what? How does it follow from this that it is therefore illegitimate?
Like, are they different in bears? Anytime you have all mammalian reproduction is rooted in the idea that there's a sexual dichotomy between male and female. To obscure that with all sorts of semantic word games about how you feel subjectively has no bearing on whether male and female are categories that exist.
Then why are you even bringing up reproduction at all? The whole point trans people are making is that when they tell you their gender, what they are saying has no bearing on the reproductive system. The whole point is that these two are distinct things. I disagree that reproduction always involves a biological dichotomy, but I agree with Ben that gender identity has nothing to say about that, which is what makes it odd that he brought it up in the first place.
And if you're trying to define male and female with reference to any subjective category that cannot be identified by any metric whatsoever other than how you feel today,
insofar as you define male and female as exclusively biological categories, nobody is doing that. Male and female can be used as biological terms, but as the APA makes clear, they can also be used as gender terms. Ben's problem is that he is conflating the two distinct contexts in which these terms are used.
I challenge whether that is scientific or whether that is merely a self-perception that is being guided by a political agenda.
What would that agenda be? If trans people are perceiving themselves to be gender identities that don't correlate with the reproductive system because they want to achieve some kind of political goal, what do you think that goal is? What goal is served by that?
To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.